I don't care how late you stay out. Stay out as late as you want. You want to borrow the new car? You want to borrow my credit card? Kids today, they really have it rough. I have no idea where we are or where we're going. I mean, when I was their age, life was easy, super easy. Why haven't you gotten a tattoo yet? How come you don't have any piercings yet? Yep, we're lost. We are completely lost. Ooh, sports. Just do whatever the mechanic says to do. Vehicle maintenance is completely overrated. Look, whatever the mechanic is asking, just pay him. Pay him whatever he wants. I wish they had soap operas at night. I like that boy. You should date him. You should date him immediately. Well, what about the creepy guy with the motorcycle? He's cute. Yeah, sure. Spring break in Tahiti sounds fun. Hey, make sure you get all your video games done before you start your homework. You don't have to pass all your classes. What? You have a project due tomorrow and you've known about it for 4 weeks and you haven't started yet? Sweet! Doesn't anybody want to know if we're there yet? Remember, if you need anything between midnight and 4 a.m., please come wake me up. Hey, I'm on the phone. Could you bring the baby over and let him climb all over me? Hey, can you please turn that music up?
Looks like Nick Fields.
Well, we just stopped for lunch 10 minutes ago, but yeah, let's stop again. I never have trouble with my toddler. I never have trouble with my teenagers. I never have trouble with my adult children. You know, she's right. We are ruining her life. Yes, more homework to correct. All right, whining. Yay, tantrums. Vomit. I just really need to spoil these kids more. Sorry, buddy. I don't know any good jokes at all. You're 16. You pretty much know everything now. I think 18's a great age to get married. Okay, remember, make sure you turn on all the lights before you leave the house. Hey, could you leave the front door open for a couple hours? Thanks. Whoa, money really does grow on trees.
I love that. You're right. That's something I would never say, any of those. Pay the mechanic whatever he wants. Rod tells his kids all the time, vehicle maintenance is highly overrated, right? Is that what you tell them? Oh, things that fathers don't say. What about things fathers do say? That's a tougher thing, right? If you got your Bibles, go ahead and turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. I want to look today at an incredible father-son story, one that actually is kind of difficult to understand a little bit, even from God's side of things, and I hope to maybe shed a little bit of light on that for you today. But you ever had and probably if we took some moments this morning, maybe a long time, you could remember a moment in your childhood where your dad made a lasting impact on you when a life lesson was learned. I have a number of them, and my backside still hurts. No, I'm just kidding. My dad didn't have time to spank me. He was too busy with my sister. But that's another story for another day. Love you, Laura, if you're watching this one. Anyway, there was the time, I shared a story before, I won't take very long with it, but when I was in Bible college, I decided that I'd really like to get a motorcycle, and Dad had one that he was selling, and he got a new motorcycle. And so we worked out a deal for me to get that, and I kept calling him and kept bugging him, you know, when can I get the bike, when can I get the bike? And he said, well, you know, we kept putting it off a little bit, and he came up one weekend. And I didn't know this at the time, but he had decided before he came, because I've been pestering him so much, that he was not going to let me have the bike no matter what I said or did, because he wanted to teach me something. I hate that when that happens. And so he came up for the weekend, and of course I gave him all the reasons, and you know, he's saying, well, I'm afraid that you won't get your studies done if you had a motorcycle, and he was probably right. I'd be on that a lot. And I made all my arguments, and I remember we were sitting at dinner at my aunt's house in Oregon, Illinois, and I got mad during the meal, and I got up and walked out and slammed the door because he was being unreasonable. And for my dad, it was unreasonable. It wasn't his normal thing, but it's where we were, and I slammed the door and walked out. They were leaving that afternoon, and I went back to the dorm, and a couple days later in the mail, I got a note from my dad, which I knew was coming. for these kids over here, mail, they used to take it out to the road and put a little letter in a box, and a guy comes by, picks it up, puts it in his truck, and he'll drive it anywhere in the country. And then he'll put it in your box, and you can open it up and read it. Mail. They look confused. I just want to explain that process. So I got this letter in the mail, and Dad says to me, "You with me?" All right. He said to me, I decided before I came that no matter what you said, I wasn't going to let you have the bike right then. He said, because I wanted to see how you reacted to somebody who was over you, even though they were being unreasonable. You need to learn how to deal with those folks, and you did not do well. He says, you can come get the motorcycle anytime you want. And I'm like, well, I don't want it now. Well, that's not true. I went and got it. But anyway, it was one of those life lessons. And our dads, and I'm just going to say this out loud, young people, your dad and mom are not to be your best friend. They're to be your parents and to train you in the ways of righteousness. Now, they can certainly are your friends and can be your friends, but that's not their main job. It's to train in righteousness. And my dad felt that as a young man going into the ministry, that there would be people around me that at times would be unreasonable, and that I needed to know how to deal with them in a more Christ-like way than what I was doing. One of those stories we're going to look at today is, we often look at this from Abraham's point of view. It's a story when Abraham took his son Isaac up to the mountain to sacrifice him to the Lord. Isaac hates this story. It always makes him nervous. And it should. And by the way, I got a hill I want you to go see with me today. And we often look at this story from Abraham's point of view, like how in the world could he willingly take his son up to be sacrificed? And we're going to go through all that in a minute. But what I want us to focus on a little bit today is, as I'll give you a spoiler alert, he doesn't kill him, all right? The Lord stops it before it happens and gives him another sacrifice. If you don't know the story, that's kind of the gist of it. The Lord tells him to sacrifice his son. He goes to do it. Before he does it, God stops him, provides a ram, and they come back home. But what do you think that day meant to Isaac? And of course, our immediate thoughts go to negative things. My dad was going to kill me. Well, what dad hasn't wanted to kill his son, right? Come on, let's be honest here. But this was to the Robert's. Willie, don't sit by your dad. He's shaking his head awful hard over here. But you know, what an incredible impact. And we're going to see, I think, an impact for the future and for faith. We're talking about men forging families of faith. And Hebrews chapter 11, it gives us an insight. This is kind of after the story, but it gives us an insight to what Abraham was thinking on this particular event. In Hebrews chapter 11, I want to look at verse 17. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. Notice the language, his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. And he considered that God is able to raise men even from the dead, from which he also received him, Isaac, back as a type. Keep that phrase in mind, as a type, that there was something going on here beyond just Abraham being asked to offer his son Isaac. It was going to be a type, a taste of what was become, that he was to offer his only begotten son. Now, the story, the backstory to all this, is that God had promised Abraham at 75 years old that he would have a kid. My brother Danny came over last week with his 3 kids, and man, they are loud. And it's not just his kids, all kids. When you hit 53, everything is louder, even though you can't hear as well. Everything is louder. And they're chasing them around and picking up the messes and cleaning diapers, and I'm thinking, Lord, I thank you that those days are done. And anyway, God told Abraham he had no kids, and Sarah had no kids, and it was really heartbreak for them. And at 75 years old, God tells Abraham that you will have a son. He was getting ready to give his kingdom over to one of his servants who wasn't even Jewish. And he was going to do that because that was the closest one to him. God says, you're going to get a son. At 75, he tells him that. And then 76, he doesn't have one. 77, he doesn't have one. 78, he doesn't have one. 9, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, all the way up to 100, he doesn't have a kid. I don't want one now. I didn't really want one at 75. But they did. They wanted one. And after almost 25 years, the promise is finally fulfilled, and Sarah conceives and gives birth to Isaac. And it's in that 25 years of waiting that I think God really grew this faith in Abraham. And he is called the father of the faithful. And it was in these small steps. Now, in between that time, Abraham was not perfect, and neither was Sarah. In fact, they were a mess for quite a while. In fact, they took things in their own hands and tried to bring a son another way, rationalize, oh, maybe he meant this, maybe he meant that. Maybe he meant, I'll take your handmaid and we'll have a child by her and we'll call it ours, and maybe that's what God meant. He knew that's not what God meant, but he took matters in his own hands. And yet, after 25 years, it's amazing enough that God was going to give him a child at 75, let alone at 100. And when God provides at 100, excuse me, Abraham begins to understand, if God says it, it is going to happen. And that is what Abraham needed to learn to be the father of the faithful. You're in Hebrews. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11, the first and second verse. He says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Being assured of what you're hoping for and convicted about what's not seen. So in other words, if God says, I'm going to have a kid, and that kid is going to have more children than you can even count, which he did promise him that through Isaac, all the descendants will come, and the whole earth will be blessed through him, which means from the descendants of Isaac would come Jesus, and Jesus would redeem the whole world. And so God says, you're going to have a son. Isaac is going to be his name. And by the way, Isaac means he laughs, or they laugh. When God told Sarah that at 70-something, she was going to have a child, she laughed. And didn't really believe it at first. We had 2 children, and we stopped at 2. And the day before fuel, a couple days before fuel, Susan comes to me and says, I might be pregnant. I said, well, you can't be. We stopped with 2. And so I was leaving Sunday, and she said, I'll go to the doctor Monday. And I remember exactly where I was at fuel when she called me. And she says, we're having another one. And just like Sarah, I laughed, but it was like this. So we thought Isaac would be a good name for him. And by the way, I've got a hill I want you to look at today. So another thumbs up. All right, good. I want you to understand something about faith, guys. Father's Day, we tend to pick on the dads, and you need to do better, you need to do better. Sometimes that's what dads respond to, men respond to. But we're not perfect. Never are going to be. Abraham's faith was not perfect from the first time God called him from where he was to go to a land that he would show him, not know where he was heading. But all he knew was that I believe that God spoke to me, so I'm going to get up and go, and he'll tell me when I get there. There was a lot of faith in that, but his faith was far from perfect. Faith is very incremental. One small decision after another builds a depth of faith that when the time comes that God calls you to something big, it's just like something small. And you think, well, God always comes through in the small, he'll come through in the big. And when God finally tells him, take your son, go offer him on the altar, the son that I promised you up on the altar, the one that you said would have kids, he hasn't had any yet. So if I take him up to the altar and sacrifice him, either going to raise him from the dead or you can provide another way. And that's what Hebrews 11 tells us, that Abraham was convinced. Assured of things hoped for, convicted of things not seen. He was convinced that he and Isaac were going up to the hill and he and Isaac were coming back down, because the same God that promised Isaac also promised that Isaac would have kids. And he went up there absolutely convinced that Isaac was not going to be left up on the altar dead. That's an amazing amount of faith and conviction that did not come immediately. Some of you dads are sitting here and think, man, I don't have anything close to that faith. Well, neither did Abraham. He was almost 116, 118 here at this point in the story in Genesis 22. If you want to go ahead and start finding that, we're going to look at that story that Hebrews refers to. It's in Genesis 22. Building a family of faith is something that happens over a lifetime. When your kids see you make small decisions on the things that are eternal versus the things that are temporary. You're going to hear me say that a lot today. That Abraham was making decisions based on what was eternal versus what is temporary. So much of this world yells at us to deal with the temporary and yells so loud that we drown out the eternal that God is asking us to do. I've said it a million times, so I'll say it 1,000,001. The best thing, the greatest thing you can ever give to your kids is faith in Jesus Christ. Everything else you give them, as nice as it will be and as great as it is to enjoy, there's nothing wrong with enjoying a house, car, job, inheritance, all those things. As great as all those things are, they're temporary. They're going to burn. But if you give them faith in Jesus Christ, you'll get to spend eternity with your kids instead of 70 years. I'll take that trade any day. The number one thing for me as a dad is that my kids are with me in God's kingdom. That is it. Everything else is to the side. I care about all the other things, but that's primary for me. And I have been far from perfect. But every little step of faith I take in small things, I hope my kids see that. And if you've had great faith stories of where you knew God was asking you to do something that was scary and you did it and God came through, you need to tell your kids those stories. How many times did Isaac tell his kids, the day Grandpa took me up on the hill to kill me? You know he told that story. I walked on the moon. Yeah, that's an old joke. Anyway, everybody tries to top everyone's story, you know. I had 2 teeth pulled. Well, I had 6. Yeah. My dad was great. My dad was going to kill me, and he didn't. Oh, that's awesome. You know, who topped the stories. So God finally gives him a kid. And that kid is now probably, we don't know for certain, but probably a teenager. 16, maybe to 18 years old, which makes Abraham 116 to 118. Genesis 22. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So he doesn't tell him exactly where to go, but just tells him the direction, and then I'll show you, just like he did when he called him out of his original homeland. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. He split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Just stop there for a minute. Just that much of it amazes me. God tells this 116, 118-year-old man, the son of your promise that you've waited for so long, I would like you to go take him now and take him up and sacrifice him to me on an altar on a mountain in Moriah. By the way, it is the same mount, knowing God, the very same mountain and probably the very same place in which Jesus would be crucified thousands of years later. Remember it said in Hebrews that he did this as a type? Mount Moriah in that area is where Solomon later go, Jerusalem, and build his first temple. It was on those mountains in Moriah that Jesus would be tried and then crucified over on the hill of Golgotha. And just knowing God, I believe with all my heart the very spot where Abraham built that altar is probably the very place where they stood the cross up and put the ram that was caught in the thicket we're going to see here in a minute as a type. Now, it's interesting, and the thing that comes to mind very often is, why in the world would God ask us to kill a child? God never intended to have Isaac killed by Abraham. That was totally outside of the parameters of what God says in his word. I think it's one of the reasons why Abraham knew that he and Isaac were coming back. But he was testing Abraham, not because God needed to know if Abraham's heart was there. He knew Abraham. Abraham needed to know his heart was there. And Isaac needed to know that God had Abraham's back and his back, and so the test was given. This was a big stretch for Abraham. This was outside of the character of God, and he knew that. And he also knew, like I've already said, that God promised that Isaac would have kids, and he hadn't had any yet. So it's amazing to me, God tells him, Abraham, take your son and sacrifice him. It says he got up early in the morning and left. Man, if there's any morning to sleep in, that'd be it, right? Drag your feet, splitting wood with a pocket knife. You know? Here's my theory, though. One reason he got up early in the morning is so he didn't have to tell Sarah what he was about to do. He was hiding it from the baby mama. All right, I'm going to take your son up on the hill and sacrifice him. Oh, no, you're not. You know, one of those things. He got up early, maybe hiding it from Sarah. That's probably not true. Sarah probably knew exactly what was going on. Now, here's the thing I want us to understand and focus on when we go through this story. There seems to be no resistance from anyone in the story, including Isaac. Why is that? Because Abraham had already been forging faith in his wife and in his kid. He had told the stories to his boy of how God called him out of the Ur of the Chaldees and took him a land that he didn't know and made of him a great family and powerful. And how God had been with him, and that God had promised Isaac to him at 75, and he had to wait 25 years, but God did come through like he always does. And if God says, Isaac, you're having kids, you're going to have kids. And he talked about, they probably even started naming Isaac's kids' names, how many there might be. He told the stories. Sarah, by then, knew also those stories, and her faith was deep. And when God says, go sacrifice your son, there seems to be absolutely no resistance to that, because they knew it wasn't going to happen. But if God says to do it, they also knew they had to. And it says, so he gets up early in the morning. And he rose and he took 2 guys with him and his son. Place we told him. Now look at verse 4 of Genesis 22. On the 3rd day. Does that sound familiar? Ring any bells with Jesus and his crucifixion? On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Put yourself in your mind's eye to a Middle Eastern scene. The landscape as you picture it, and you're walking towards these hills, and on day 3 you stop and look up at the mountains of Moriah. You see it in your mind's eye, and as you're standing there looking at the mountains, the Lord speaks to you and says, that one right there. And knowing that you got to finish this trek to an incredibly emotional point in your life where you're going to have to offer your son. How much praying was going on and talking to God was going on. And as you look at that place, you wonder if God didn't even speak to him and encourage him that, one day the one that's promised will come and he'll be on this very same mountain. And you picture that place, and he says he looks up on the 3rd day and saw the place. Verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. And now look at this faith. And I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham was convinced that Isaac was not coming back dead. That's hard to believe, isn't it? That kind of faith. Hebrews 11 tells us the same thing. He knew that God, at the very worst, would raise him from the dead. I think that he never thought he would die. And notice he's going to say it here in a minute. Look at verse 6. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son. Remember, they laid the cross on Jesus' back, heading up to that very same hill. He took the wood that was going to be his doom, and he laid it on his boy's back. He made him carry it. Again, as a type, Hebrews 11. He said he laid the wood on Isaac, his son, and he took his hand and fire and the knife. And so the two of them walked up on together. Now this is where Isaac is getting intrigued with the story. And he says to his dad, hey, Pops, I noticed we left the donkey down here. And we didn't bring a lamb. I see the wood, see the knife, see the fire. What's the plan here? My guess is Abraham maybe hasn't told him what the Lord had said yet. And I imagine that conversation happened from the time they left the group as they walked up the hill. And look what he says, verse 7. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Verse 8. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb," not his kid, the lamb, provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. Abraham was convinced that God was going to provide a lamb, something else for the sacrifice. It just was in the nature of God to do such a thing. He would not call him to sacrifice the kid that was a child of promise, his only begotten son. He says there will be a lamb provided. Verse 9, when they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Stop there for a minute. Let's remember the story. Abraham's 118 around there. Isaac is 18. Isaac doesn't get bound unless Isaac lets himself get bound. Nothing else, you can outrun Dad, right? And it'd be Bolton. Usain Bolt would have nothing over Isaac today, right? There's something transcendent going on here. There is a faith forged in this family that goes beyond comprehension that did not happen overnight. I'm sure Abraham and Isaac had that conversation all the way up the hill, and as they're building the altar, Abraham begins to tell Isaac what God has told him. And as he tells him that the Lord has asked me to bring you here to sacrifice you to him, he's also telling him that there's no way you and I aren't going back down this hill, because God promised that you're going to have children, and you don't have any, and that is going to happen. Absolute depth of faith that happened over a very long time, but it happened incrementally, which we need to understand. And Abraham knew that he must focus on the eternal more than the temporary. I suppose in his wildest imagination, at the very worst, that he would rather obey God than keep his son for a few more years. In that day and age, it could not be very long that someone would live. But he was convinced that that wasn't going to happen. But he was focusing on the eternal, the call of God, over the temporary. We get so wrapped up in the temporary with our kids. The house, the job, the career, the sport, the whatever. And we forget to put in them faith, the things that will last forever. He binds his son and he puts him on the altar. And I believe that Isaac willingly did that. Just let that sink in for a minute. My guess is that this young man, Isaac, 16 to 18, already had a depth of faith way beyond his father's when he was 75. Because the father was forging in him this undying commitment that God always provides. And if God says something's going to happen, it is absolutely going to happen. And by the way, God also said that he will send a son back and he will judge the world and the kingdom will be set up here. That is going to happen. And my call to you, dads, are your kids ready for that? There will be no avoiding that day. The bank accounts won't matter. The careers won't matter. All that matters is do they know Jesus Christ deep in their hearts, and have they walked in faith with him. Isaac says, I just picture him saying, I got it, Dad. I believe you. I know God. He's not going to let this happen. He promised me kids. I'm going to have kids. Here, tie my hands up. I'll climb on the altar. You and I both know who our God is. Let's do this. They didn't understand it, and that's the problem with things of faith. If you understand it, it takes no faith. Now, God, you think, why would God ask somebody to do that? That just seems so wrong. I mean, man, if he's going to ask somebody to do that, he should be willing to do it Self. The difference is he asked Abraham to do it, no intention of letting him go through it, but he himself was going to do it and did go through it with it and let his son be beaten to death for you and me on that very same hill. Can you imagine God in heaven watching this scene, knowing that a few thousand years from now, his only son is going to be there on a cross, humiliated, spat on, shamed, mocked, and killed for the righteousness of the world? He was asking Abraham to do something that Abraham was not going to have to do, but that God himself would very much have to do. How could you ask a dad to do that? Well, he was asking himself to do the very same thing as a type. We're going to see it lived out in Isaac. Verse 10, Abraham stretched out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 2 1/8, 2 1/4, 2 5/16. Put his hand on the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord, verse 11, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. I don't think he had to call him twice. He probably heard him the first time. He was waiting for the call. Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Again, this is a type. As we sit here and think, how in the world could Abraham ever raise that knife to his boy? We have to ask ourselves the type of the same question, how in the world could God raise his hand against his son? Now that is amazing love. How can it be that you, my king, would die for me? Right? How deep the Father's love for us. How vast beyond all measure that he should give his only son to make a wretch his treasure. We sit here and we see ourselves in Abraham or Isaac and we think, how in the world? Abraham, how in the world could you raise your hand? Isaac, how in the world could you let him bind you? God, how could you raise your hand against your son? Jesus, how could you let them bind you? Because they're absolutely crazy about you and in hot pursuit over your spirit that dwells within you. Scripture says that Jesus could have called a legion of angels. Trust me, he did not have to be bound. He did not have to go to the cross. But as a type, we see it here lived out, knowing that it was never going to happen, but to give us a taste of and experience the dilemma and the pain and the angst that was going on in Abraham and Isaac. Put yourself on the altar, laying there like Isaac, seeing your dad lift up the knife over you. Your dad. How would you feel? Even if you had faith. I can't believe it. Maybe you understand the words now from the Lord. My God, why have you forsaken me? The depth of that moment, a realization of all the sins of the world coming on a man who never had sin. At the hands of God, letting it happen so that he could buy you back when you didn't even ask to be bought back. He says, you would not withhold your only son from me, and God did not withhold his only son from us. In verse 13, Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket. His head was caught in thorns. Caught in the thicket by his horns, and Abraham went and took the ram excitedly. I'm sure he probably skipped over there, and offered him up as a burnt offering in the place of his son. In the place of his son, and in the place of us, he offered his son, Jesus, God did. Then Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Jehovah Jireh, Yahweh Jireh, the Lord shall provide. This mountain shall be, on this mountain it shall be provided. The very mountain where Christ was crucified thousands of years later, it shall be provided, and it was provided. He said, that's what we're going to call this place. Verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven, as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, God had been promising since chapter 12 that he would have a kid, and that through that kid his descendants will be blessed. But now that he is at full obedience and absolutely believes that God was going to do that with Isaac, that he knew he could kill him and he'd raise him from the dead, Hebrews 11. That's what it came to. God says, now that you are fully with me on this, he said, now I'm just promising, I swear to you that you will possess the gates of your enemies, and that your descendants will be great, and the promise of Messiah will come through Isaac. All the descendants of the earth will be blessed. What an incredible father-son story. Now, here's the good news. I'm pretty certain God's not going to ask you to take your kid up on a hill and kill him. You're in luck. But what is he asking us to do? I think he's asking us to live in the eternal and not the temporary. That our kids, when they see us make decisions about this life, we make decisions filtered through faith of what is to come, not necessarily what is. And there are going to be times in your life when you're faced with a dilemma. Do I do what's easy? Do I do what the world is asking me to do to save myself some trouble right now? Or do I stand up for what's right and do what's right, even though it may cost me right now? That's what this story is asking us to do as dads. That we are to lead our families. The scripture says that. And you are the leader of your family, for good or ill. You're the leader. By not leading, you're leading them in a direction. What he is asking us to do is that we make choices that are right before God, not necessarily right for the moment. And those two things are very often quite different. Are we going to live for the eternal and not the temporary? Do our kids see that in us? Do our kids know that above everything else, we want to be in the kingdom and we want them there? And we are not going to sell our salvation for a lie or cheating here or there, or for things that would compromise who we are or our standards. And that our kids know the thing that number one to dad is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not yet seen. Amen. That's what our kids need, and I know you guys have the ability to do that. I'm not asking you to, if you say, I have very little faith right now, Jesus says, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. Just take what you got and start there. Abraham, go back and read his story if you want. It is not pretty. Read Isaac's story afterwards. It's still not pretty. He has some messes in there. But little by little, they trust God and they do, and they grow in their faith. And that is all the Lord is asking you to do right now. Just say, Lord, today I want to start thinking of the eternal more than the temporary. I want my kids with me forever, not just wealthy or blessed in this life. Nothing wrong with both of those things, by the way. You can have salvation forever and blessings and wealth in this life, if that's the Lord's will for you. Please do not hear me condemning that. But trust me, your kids know what matters to you. What's most important. Let's make it a faith. The worship team would come up. We're going to sing the song Kindness. It's your kindness, Lord, that leads us to repentance. Your favor, Lord, is our desire. This song is what I'm asking us to do. Lord, that's what we want. We want your favor. We want to be in a place that we are consumed with the eternal over the temporary. And if you're sitting here feeling like, man, I got some failures in my life as a dad or a mom, yeah, well, welcome. Welcome. God knows that. He's not surprised. Does he want you to do better? Sure he does. And he's willing to help you walk in that. We're going to sing the song Kindness, and just hear the words and make this your heart's desire, that men, we would forge families of great faith. And if you don't know the Lord, we encourage you to come up as we sing. Right after that song, we ask you to hang out for just one more minute, and we're going to baptize Myra here in just a moment. Let's stand and sing Kindness.